after we hear the next paper, which will be given by Amy Norgard. Amy is an assistant professor of classics at Truman State University, where she teaches the Latin language, ancient culture, and classical reception in film and media studies. She serves as the faculty advisor for Eta Sigma Phi and is part of a team that is currently making preparations to host the spring convention virtually. Her research interests include Roman satire, the senses in ancient literature and film reception, especially cinematic horror. She is currently working on a chapter contribution for the edited volume, Women in Classical Video Games, which is the basis of her presentation today. And as you can see, that will be entitled, Bringing Down the Divine Patriarchy Through Deicide in Apotheon from 2015. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Thank you again to my panelists, fellow panelists, our chair, Kirsten, the AIMS officers, and also for you for sticking it out to the bitter end here. So let's bring this thing home, shall we? Apotheon is an action platformer set in archaic Greece from independent gaming developer Alien Trap. It's available on PC, also Xbox, PlayStation 4, and newly the Switch. However, the ancient Greece in the game is fictionalized to depict gods who have departed from humanity. They withhold their gifts of food, protection, and civilization from mortals, all by Zeuss's order. Referencing man's degenerating stages of development from Hesiod's works and days, Zeus in the game says, quote, "I have watched 5 ages of man rise and fall, each generation more flawed than the last. How low you have sunk." Apotheon then imagines Hesiod's prediction for the end of the Iron Age for the interactive gaming world. Within this setting, the goddess Hera seizes a chance for redemption. Spiteful of her husband's infidelities, she orchestrates a deicide, or the violent destruction of the immortal Greek gods, to take down Zeus in particular. She summons the gamer, playing as a mortal warrior, Nicandrios, to help her in this endeavor. Zeus has betrayed humans, she says. Disheartened by the gods withholding their gifts, Nicandrios readily accepts Hera's mission to become her champion and primary instrument to strip the gods of their power. With every god that Nicandrius kills, their immortality is conferred upon him through the collection of divine trophies like Apollo's lyre, Artemis's bow, Poseidon's trident, etc. Armed with these trophies, Nicandrius grows more powerful than the gods themselves, leading to his ultimate apotheosis. I'm going to show a little bit of gameplay here, but I didn't do sound so I could talk over it. So here you get a little bit of visuals. Apotheon is what's called a 2D platformer, which means that the player jumps from platform to platform while the gamer takes on a third-person viewpoint of the action. There's a designated path to continue the narrative. You have tasks to complete, things like that. But there's lots of opportunity to explore the game, explore the world that's been created here, and acquire treasures along the way, like weapons and things. Most of the time, the player moves through the game, killing enemies in what's known as hack and slash gameplay. This means that the player hits, swipes, stabs, shoots, and otherwise tries to kill enemies to progress through the game. Enemies have a health bar that is winnowed away with each hit until they are dead. Immediately striking is Apotheon's visual aesthetic that evokes Greek black figure pottery with a new and colorful backdrop for every stage. This aspect has been unanimously lauded by gaming critics, with one critic calling the game, quote, "a handmade pot on every screen." In addition to featuring Greek pottery aesthetics, Apotheon also incorporates textual primary sources throughout, like here, when the player enters the Temple of Hera, a line from the Hymn to Hera shows up. These inclusions speak to the expertise of Apotheon writer-designer Maciej Paprocki, classicist and historical gaming consultant, and he's been in attendance with us this weekend as well. Paprocki argues that fashioning a, quote, post-apocalyptic and post-mythological version of ancient Greece provides an opportunity for creative storytelling, including the integration of deicide. In reimagining Greek mythology in this way, I also see that Apotheon is applying modern standards of gender equality to criticize the treatment of women in ancient literature. So, today, I'm going to talk about how Apotheon incorporates female voices and characters, particularly through the deicide motif. Several female divinities actively defy the male gods by lending aid to Nicandrios, with some even seeking revenge for oppression and violence perpetrated against them. Daphne is one of these characters, and Thetis will also come in as a voice too, that I'll talk about. The game also addresses the female presence through so-called boss battles or boss fights. Some female deities like Artemis and Athena are fought and defeated in innovative ways that sets them apart from their male counterparts. But I first want to take a brief dive into the depictions of deicide in modern media preceding 2015 to address the innovative elements of Apotheon's deicide. I argue that a cast of female characters acting as the driving force behind a deicide is a unique storyline within any screen text incorporating the Greco-Roman gods. Despite a portrayal of female gods that criticizes the ancient patriarchy, I still see ambiguity within Apotheon's own promotion of gender equality in gameplay, narrative, and characterization, which I'll get to at the end. So deicide, the death of a god, should be a paradoxical concept. How can an immortal being be killed? The Greeks and Romans did not think their gods could die or be killed, supplanted maybe, but not killed. From as early as Homer, the gods are forever deathless and ageless. Yet in popular screen text across film, television, and video games, deicide is a frequent motif for portraying the vulnerability of the gods and the supremacy of humanity physically and morally. Classic scholar Vincent Tommaso distinguishes between two models of deicide, vanishing death and violent death. In both types of deicide, the death of the gods is treated as a metaphor for humans evolving beyond the Greco-Roman gods, who exhibit an outdated and irrelevant worldview for contemporary viewers and players. Tommaso attributes this to later Judeo-Christian attitudes about the gods' perceived fickleness and moral failure as characters. In the vanishing motif, the gods are suggested to vanish over time from the existence as an indication of human progress that no longer requires their worship. One cinematic example of the vanishing motif is Desmond Davis's Clash of the Titans. Zeus, played by Laurence Olivier, postulates that the gods, quote, may no longer be needed if humanity continues to exhibit exceptional heroism like that of Perseus. The 2010 remake of Clash and 2012 follow-up Wrath of the Titans pick up on this notion to varying degrees as well. Another example of the vanishing motif comes from Star Trek, the original series, the episode Who Mourns for Adonais. The Enterprise crew encounters an omnipotent alien who claims to be the very same Apollo worshipped on Earth by the Greeks. When humanity moved on from worshiping the pagan gods, Apollo's fellow gods willfully left Earth and vanished into the cosmic winds, a sort of death for long-lived beings like themselves. But Apollo chooses to remain and demand worship. In the violent side of things here, the gods are killed by violent means, sometimes by an exceptional human, like a hero, but sometimes by other divinities. Apotheon falls into this category clearly. In a cinematic example that came out just prior to Apotheon, Tarsem Singh's Immortals from 2011 features a second Titanomachy, in which the Greek gods take on their previously vanquished foe. Many Titans and Olympians are killed in the ensuing bloody battle, including Athena. There are a few standout examples of women playing a primary role in deicide in television, which is kind of my main focus here. So I wanted to draw attention to Hercules' Legendary Journeys and Xena Warrior Princess, these consummate 90s television series set in the ancient Mediterranean, but which draw upon an array of various mythologies. In the Hercules episode, God-Fearing Child from season 5, Hercules, played by Kevin Sorbo, kills Zeus with a dagger made from Kronos' rib. Interestingly, Hercules is aided by Hera, in a rare alliance. Hera announces that she believes it's destiny for the gods to cede to humanity, calling them her children. Hera is actually then first killed by Zeus when he realizes her deceit. And so I think this is kind of an interesting intertext to look at when we're looking at, Hera and Apotheon as the main driving force behind the deicide. In the Xenoverse, in the episode Motherhood, the titular Amazonian warrior played by Lucy Lawless is imbued with the ability to kill immortals to protect her daughter from the gods bent on her destruction. In the course of the episode, Xena goes on a god-killing rampage, taking out 5 gods who had been series regulars up until this point. I'd like to draw attention to this example in particular as a deicide where women and female relationships are highlighted. The deicide is not only committed by a woman, but she's assisted by another woman, Gabrielle, played by Renee O'Connor. And the primary divine antagonist is Athena at this point because Zeus is dead, remember? Furthermore, Xena's god-killing power stems from her role of mother to protect her daughter. This example establishes a precedent for deicide performed by a woman and features the supremacy of women over the divine is strengthened by their relationships with one another. So arguably, the most direct influence of deicide for a video game is going to be a video game, and that's, of course, the God of War series. In the first series of the game, God of War from 2005, the gamer plays as Spartan hero Kratos, who seeks to kill the god Ares with the help of Athena. So there's another kind of female aid here, a female helper. Kratos ultimately ascends to godhood himself to replace Ares as the new god of war. In a way, deicide is a natural outcome for games that employ hack and slash fighting mechanics, as both God of War and Apotheon do. Hack and slash necessitates that someone has to die for you to progress through the game, even if they're immortal beings, I suppose. The transference of the violent deicide motif to a gaming format allows the gamer to be an agent in the deicide, directly participating in a trope familiar from other screen media. So again, my aim in bringing up these examples is to investigate what role female divinities play in the dismantling of a divine patriarchy. The extent to which this happens in Apotheon, as I'm about to show, seems to be rather unique in this kind of variant of a deicide formula. Like its predecessors, Apotheon's deicide is payback for the gods' moral failing in their ill treatment of humans, and particularly for the ill treatment of women. Apotheon takes deicide to the next level when Nicandrios comes to ultimately replace all of the gods, not just one of them, but all of the gods that he has destroyed, signaling the need for a wholesale regime change, even of the female gods themselves. So let's jump into Apotheon here. First, female divinities, Daphne and Thetis, act as helpers to Nicandrios. They actively defy the male gods because they disagree with their actions and even call them out for their abuses of power. The motivations of these female characters have precedent in ancient literature, but the articulation of their motivations within Apotheon have been augmented to fit the theme of women's empowerment. In Apotheon, Daphne appears as a woman with tree-shaped appendages under guard on a pedestal in the garden of Apollo. She becomes an ally of Nicandrios to take down Apollo, her captor and violator. She recounts the well-known Ovidian tale of her encounter with Apollo from her own perspective. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Daphne is described as an object to be desired. Apollo greedily praises her bare body parts and undresses the rest of her with his gaze. As Apollo chases Daphne, the reader is told, quote, she was still a lovely sight, fetishizing Daphne's fear and lack of consent. Even after she is transformed, Apollo still makes advances, pressing his hand against her trunk, embracing her limbs, and kissing her wood. When he adopts the laurel tree as a symbol, Daphne accepts her new reality. She, quote, bowed her new branches and seemed to nod her leafy head in assent, or her leafy crown in assent. In her own voice, Apotheon's Daphne clarifies the violation she faced, rejecting Ovid's suggestion of assent on her part. After her transformation, she says that Apollo, quote, tears me from the earth and plants me in his private gardens where he has unfettered access to continually caress her unwilling branches with his spidery fingers. So in effect, Apollo's adoption of the laurel as a symbol has been twisted into a further violation, almost like a rapist taking a trophy as a way to relive his sexual exploit. Through Daphne, Apotheon provides an interpretation of Ovid from a perspective of gender studies and contemporary norms pertaining to sex and consent. Giving Daphne a voice to speak, her rape and sexual assault turns into a bit of a champion for women's rights in a patriarchal world. The actions of the male gods, then, are contrary to modern moral values. Thetis, later in the game, the water nymph Thetis appears in Poseidon's waters, presenting herself as an ally of Nicandrios. She is sympathetic to the objective of taking down the gods. In ancient traditions, Thetis is best known as the mother of the great warrior Achilles. You may know her best as well from Iliad Book 1. Thetis beseeches Zeus to punish the Achaeans on behalf of her son's anger at Agamemnon. In that iconic scene of supplication, Thetis sits before Zeus and she cups his chin with her right hand, very much, in a begging position, physically lowering herself, right, to his power. Although intent to remain neutral, Zeus grants Thetis' appeal, perhaps because he owes her one for saving him once, as Homer mentions in a previous line. In popular media, you may remember Thetis from her role in Clash the Titans, played by Maggie Smith. Here too, she acts boldly to protect her monstrous son, Calibos. She even illicitly manipulates Perseus's fate by moving his associated clay figurine in the arena of life, a privilege afforded only to Zeus. She also ridicules Zeus for his unwanted sexual advancements with the other female divinities. So, though considered a lesser divinity, Thetis exhibits influence over even the king of the gods. And so in keeping with her portrayal in these other areas, Apotheon's Thetis claims to have influence of her own in these waters. Even here, she acts as a protectress of her favorite mortal by providing Nicandrus with a ship to help him escape Poseidon's gaze. Although her aims have traditionally been at odds with Hera, in Apotheon, she is newly aligned with Hera, with whom she has a mutual understanding, even if it's tentative. So even when Thetis and Hera are fighting on the same side, it's clear that the female divinities are acting as a cohesive unit toward a common goal. Two other female deities I'd like to talk about are Artemis and Athena, and they are treated in the game as more traditional opponents that Nicandrus must defeat in so-called boss battles. By observing these boss fights, we will see how the female deities are treated differently from the male deities on the level of game mechanics, which allows the player to sympathize with the female deities. 3 boss fights in Apotheon are against female opponents. There's Demeter, Artemis, Athena, and 4 are against male opponents, Apollo, Poseidon, Ares, and lastly Zeus, who you have to defeat twice. I've depicted a few here on the screen so you can kind of see what they look like. Poseidon is gigantic, which makes it kind of fun. The fighting formula with the male opponents is based on hack and slash, where the player physically dominates them with traditional fighting mechanics. However, the confrontations with the female deities feature unique elements that go beyond hack and slash or avoid it altogether. They present mental and emotional challenges rather than physical ones. The boss fight with Artemis does employ some hack and slash throughout, but in a far more innovative presentation. I'm going to have this play in the background while I talk. As the deity of the hunt, Artemis transforms Nicandrios into a stag, whom she then pursues. Rather than attack, Nicandrios as stag must escape the huntress and find checkpoints that reverse the transformation, turning Artemis into a deer and Nicandrios into the hunter. It's in this configuration that Artemis is vulnerable to injury. Still, the gameplay necessitates constant switching back and forth between hunter and hunted. This boss fight has been praised, rightfully, for its innovation by gaming reviews. But even beyond its innovative format, the battle perfectly encapsulates the differing power dynamics between men and women. The switch just happened in the video there. The differing power dynamics between men and women, a major theme in Apotheon. The deer hunt battle presents a unique psychological experience for the player to see the fight from the perspective of both predator and prey. It's an opportunity for the player to experience being in the vulnerable position of the hunted, a powerless object to be pursued or sought after. The player only wins the battle, though, when they are in the traditional position of the dominant hunter, a metaphor for the dominance of patriarchal values. In the battle with Athena, it similarly de-emphasizes hack and slash format. In fact, the player never once hits Athena, but instead her protectors take the brunt of the physical abuse as the players navigate a maze. Throughout the cutscene, Athena lauds Nicandrios' heroism. While she does not condone Nicandrios killing the gods, she isn't antagonistic toward Nicandrius as the male gods are. They're often, throwing insults and things. She ultimately accepts Nicandrius' heroism and his victory over her, and she entertains the possibility that the Olympians' time might be over. She says the world is changing, even stone walls will not stand forever. The mechanics of boss fight in Apotheon is constructed differently for the gender of the divine opponent. Battles with the female deities do not stress physical fighting. This directly pertains to Apotheon's main theme of bringing down the male patriarchy. The gaming format encourages the player to identify with the female characters, and it can be really difficult to do that when you're just ripping your opponent to shreds with a sword. Furthermore, the female deities tend to voice criticism of the current Olympic regime or support for humanity. Through these battles, it's apparent that the female deities are not the enemy, the male gods are. So despite Nicandrius' efforts of taking the gods' tokens for humanity, the human race perishes. He's the last one standing. So Nicandrius' only path forward is to complete the Deicide and find a place where he can belong. His only option is to essentially become a god. Although female characters are substantially integrated throughout the game, they still remain subjugated to a traditional male-centric gaming formula. The gamer plays as a man who becomes a vehicle through which the oppressed female deities communicate discontent with the divine patriarchal system. This point is underscored by the end of the game with an option for Nicandrius to kill Hera with Zeus's thunderbolt. You can kill her or leave her imprisoned. You have a choice. Although an ambiguous character with changing motivations, Hera's death represents an overt act of violence against a woman who has spoken out about the male god's abuses. Hera's death suggests that Nicandrius' new godhood, like the previous one, similarly devalues women. Throughout the game, it also seems that Nicandrius is simply using the women's aid for his own benefit, not theirs. Ironically, the more successful Nicandrius' Deicide becomes, the closer the female gods come to their own downfall. Nevertheless, the female deities are willing to take down the entire divine establishment at great cost to their own preservation. The message then seems to resonate with contemporary audiences familiar with the underlying circumstances of the Me Too movement. Women must be willing to sacrifice their own power and livelihood to voice injustice perpetrated by men. By now, the player may be growing concerned that Nicandrius is set to repeat the mistakes of the past divine regime. In the final cutscene, this concern is realized. Oh, she calls him a little whelpling, an ungrateful whelpling. It's pretty funny. In the final cutscene, this concern is not alleviated. With all the gods vanquished, a newly immortalized, also giant, Nicandrius sets to the task of repopulating the earth by fashioning men in his own image. In the role of a Promethean archetype, he molds a human out of clay. As the god and his male creation stare at one another and the shot pans away, we are left wondering how women fit into this new reality, if at all. Thank you.